Yo, what's up guys? John Boogle here. Today, we have a guide on how to use a guide. Yeah, this is real. It's not a joke. In this video, we're gonna go over a lot of things, such as how to search for the right guide, how to understand a guide more, how to approach guides, and how to actually execute them. Of course, I'll be using my guides as the main example here, but yeah, you're probably wondering why this video is even being made, and I was asking the same exact question, but over my years of making guides for this game, I've noticed one thing that does happen quite a lot, and it's actually kind of shocking. People just don't know how to use guides sometimes. You know, the classic just copy the lineup and go into the stage. But after this video, you should be a professional, or at the very least, understand how to actually use a guide properly. Without further ado, let's head in because we have a lot to talk about. We'll start with searching. Now, at some points, searching for guides can be a bit more troublesome than usual. Sometimes a guide might not have the proper metadata to pinpoint your search, or sometimes it might have the wrong metadata to give you guides that you're not really searching for, or even sometimes there's just low quality guides with no explanation or anything, which can still be used, but we'll talk about that later. It could also be maybe you don't know what right keywords to use when searching for a guide, and as a guide maker, of course, you gotta use the metadata correctly, and in my guides I always put no Ubers as the baseline because all of my guides are no Ubers, so it might be easier to search for no Uber guides than maybe guides with specific Ubers, unless they have the specific metadata. So yeah, while it may be obvious, maybe try making your search a lot more specific using keywords like no Ubers, no gacha, minimal gacha, no cyberpunk. But the more specific you get, the harder it is to find the correct guide that might fit your needs. But sometimes these videos don't have all the specifics written on paper. Sometimes you'll actually have to watch the video and break it down, but we'll move into that section later. For now, let's focus on searching. Another thing to point out is there's not only one place to search guides. You don't have to always search them on YouTube. You can just do a Google search as well, or even go into different communities like a Discord or Reddit, and usually at that point getting live help is always the best option because a guide that is posted can't really be changed. Search wise, it can be changed to help metadata. However, sometimes you'll find out not all guides are made with care. Some might not have any structure, any relevant info, or a lack of info. This is where people usually tend to just copy the lineup from the guide and hop in themselves. But the main point for searching in this small section in the beginning of the video here is use keywords when searching. Try to pinpoint your searches a lot more. Also, try to go over different sources. Search the internet as a whole and not just one section of it. Now that we've pretty much got the baseline of searching for guides, let's hop into the more bigger topic here, and that is understanding a guide. In this section of the video, we'll talk about how to better understand guides and how they're structured, well, my guides at least, since I am using them as the main example in this video. But first, what is a guide? There's many examples and definitions of it, but usually it's an indication or influence for you to complete a task or do something. Now, the biggest blunder people make when trying to understand a guide is they take it as something that is absolute, and most of the time guides are much more flexible. They point you in a certain direction. They're not meant to be followed like the Bible, word for word, pixel by pixel. It's usually something to give you a general idea or even dive into specifics of where to go or what to do for what you need. And I make this very apparent in all of my guides, yet there's still a small percentage of people who choose to ignore it, and they're stuck with a mindset of all guides are cookie cutters, when that's not really the case. Now, before we go into the whole structure of a guide, let's first go over some main things that you should know when going into a guide, and it will help you understand a guide infinitely better. So as my guides, as an example, I usually break down units in specific roles, and I usually always mention replacements or give you a general idea of which unit can fulfill a certain role. And the roles are, of course, first of all, your meat shields, your stallers, very important one. Then you have your attackers. Then it's your tankers, and then rushers, and even nukers, Ubers, legends. But the main thing is your meat shields, your attackers, tankers, and your rushers. Usually it is a stage by stage basis. Sometimes you might need a different role, like long distance units, LD units. Sometimes you'll encounter a stage where you need a nuker. Maybe there's stages where you don't use meat shields. But generally, these are the four most important roles, as they're kind of used as an umbrella that could break down into many sub roles. And honestly, I can make a whole entire separate video just going into unit roles and which units fit each roles. But for time saving sake, I won't go into that here. You can usually find them in my guides. I do explain them, but maybe down the line I would make a video of going into unit roles. Now that we understand what a guide is and the roles, let's hop into the structure of a guide. Well, my guide, at least, as the main example. Now, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you might run into guides without any structure. That's usually when you'd have to put in more work and try to break down the guide yourself. But with my guides, I usually break it down for you, and I do create a certain structure that I stay fairly true to in all of my guides. For this example, we'll be using my Crazed Axe guide. Now, I usually always break down the structure of my guides by putting it into chapters which can be easily accessible, but this often prompts people to skip parts of the video, which I don't really recommend at all, because you could be missing out on crucial pieces of information. Now, the reason I picked the Crazed Axe guide for this specific example is because the whole lineup explanation takes up nearly half of the video. And what would you do if you skipped that entire part? In the lineup explanations, I usually break down the lineup and explain the unit's roles, replacements, etc. This is usually where knowing units' roles would come in helpful, and knowing which units to replace would be entirely dependent on your account, because not everyone's account is the same. Everyone has different units, everyone has different levels, but the reason this section of this video is so long because I do go into detail explaining much more replacements and unit roles. But after the lineup explanation, there's usually an explanation for the actual stage and strategy. This is usually where I explain most of what goes on into the stage, what to look out for, what to keep in mind, and it usually gives you a general idea of which units to use at certain points of the stage, and it's basically a guide on how to use your units in the stage. And that's usually the biggest blunder. They skip the whole lineup explanation. Maybe people don't understand quite what unit roles means. They don't know which units to replace because they skipped the entire lineup explanation. They try to copy the lineup, then they just hop into the guide, and they expect it to absolutely work because in their minds, guides are absolute, but that's almost never the case because guides are usually made with minimal in mind. As a guide maker, you expect watchers and users to replace units that you use in the guide with better units, higher level units, or just sometimes putting in an Uber in an empty slot, which can't fulfill the roles mentioned in the guide, which I generally explain. Just because the guide is no gacha doesn't mean you have to do the guide no gacha as well, though there are some guides where I do break it down even further and go into many different examples. And in these guides, I am usually using lower than recommended levels because I expect you to have better levels for the stage and or better units to replace. Another great example of this that I did use before is my Relic B guide. And if you've seen this guide before, you'd know that I heavily recommended level 40 units for this stage. But since guides are usually made with minimal in mind, in this guide I only used a level 30 Manic Island. But you must be wondering, Boogle, you used a plus 70 island, and this is where understanding unit roles comes in great help, because you would know that island isn't really great for this stage with its speed. It's usually just used as a stepping stone tanker. But if you watched the lineup explanation in that guide, you would understand the unit roles and replacements, because guides, usually mine at least, are made with minimal in mind. I didn't use Can in this stage because a level 40 Can is infinitely more powerful than an Island Cat in this situation. A level 40 Fishman as a rusher could replace that role as island in this situation as well. And of course, the main thing in this guide, a level 40 manic island, is a lot better with its increase in speed, but I did mention that how I used a level 30 manic island in this guide. Understanding certain points like this can be difficult at first, but the more you've played the game, the more experience you get throughout, the easier it becomes to understand these guides, because then you'll know what roles to use, what units to replace, if you don't have a specific unit that's mentioned or showed in the guide. But most of the time, I do usually cover a general idea of that, sometimes even diving into Uber suggestions or examples like I did in that Relic B guide, for example. So the first thing to understand these guides better is to first break down the structure. If there is no structure, and if there is a structure to the guide, use it to your advantage. Don't skip out key information. And this is a perfect segue into our next section of the video, and that is how to approach these guides. Now that you have somewhat of a baseline understanding of a guide, which ones should you approach? There's many things that can affect this decision, but the main things to look for: what does the video offer? Does it have a clear structure? Are there chapters? Is it broken down into sections? And if there is no structure, what does the video have in the details? What is the description entitle? What are the comments of the video saying if there is a lack of information? And then lastly, how old is the guide? How old is the video? Usually this last part doesn't really matter, because there is rarely a case, almost never, where Ponos actually changes a stage. So guides can never become obsolete, and that's a huge thing to keep in mind when approaching guides. Because like I mentioned in the understanding a guide section, you always can approach these guides with better units, replacements, and knowledge of unit roles. So when approaching these guides, you got to keep these things in mind, and usually it does come down to a preference. My guides, as the example, usually has a bulk of explanation and information, sometimes too much. So maybe you might want to approach a more simpler guide that's not as lengthy or bulky as mine. Maybe you don't like commentary guides and you prefer text, or maybe it's the opposite, or maybe you prefer neither. In that case, it's your job to break down the structure and whatever other details you might find within the guide, whether that be in the guide itself, in the description, in the comments, etc. Because sometimes a guide might have updated information after being posted, but usually if a stage or a guide is just raw, just straight into the stage, no explanation, no details, no description either, this is not a case of just copy the lineup and hop into the stage. That is something you absolutely should never do. This is where you should put in more work yourself if you choose to approach those types of guides, because blindly just copying the lineup and going into the stage will not help you. I did mention it in a video way long before, but the biggest skill to have in Battle Cats and develop is to construct your own strategies and lineups, and this is one of the ways to exercise those skills. So when approaching guides, don't expect anything absolute. Never follow it to a 1-to-1 ratio. I covered a lot of this in my using my own guides to beat X stage videos. If you want to see perfect examples of how to approach these guides, those are the videos to go to, because if you approach these guides in a lazy mindset and you skip parts of it or unintentionally ignore crucial information, of course it'll spring out confusion. Because if you approach a guide with certain requirements, a big example of this one being Cats of the Cosmos stages with those treasures, you will have a really hard time if you don't actually listen to what the guide has to say. And it's not like this is a rare occurrence. I made this video because it is getting fairly more obvious as time goes on, especially in those Cats of the Cosmos videos where people just skip the part of the whole treasures explanation and or lineup explanation. Then they're wondering how Cat God still has 99% HP when they lose. That is exactly why always keep in mind what type of guide you're approaching. When you're approaching a lengthy guide with multiple explanations, it's probably best to not skip out on key information. So yes, big shock. Actually watch the video. You cannot approach these guides in a half-assed mindset, especially my guides as the main example. And I'm sure there are minimal effort guides out there that you could look for and approach those, but learn to discern. You can't approach a bulky guide and expect to take one small portion of it and expect to just beat the whole stage just based off that. And sometimes you might get lucky. Maybe you copy the lineup, you beat the stage. But that just continues the cycle. And eventually you'll reach a point where you don't know what's wrong anymore. And the first instinct is to blame the guide. So approach them being flexible, because that's how guides are meant to be used. They are not absolute. Make sure you have the necessary requirements. Don't be that guy trying to beat advents with a level 20 units and no treasures. Construct a lineup to the best of your ability, taking in all the information mentioned in the guide, because approaching and understanding a guide is half the equation. Executing a guide is the other half. Watch and take note of how the strategy is actually executed or explained. Take key information within the guide and keep it in the back of your mind when you're actually putting the guide into use and executing it. Keep in mind of any replacements that are mentioned and the requirements. If you have the key gacha units, don't use the no gacha portion of the guide. Executing these guides can be a bit more difficult if there are multiple complications in the stage, but if the guide does explain it, keep mind of those key informations or mental notes of enemies in the stage, enemy cycles, timings, and every other piece of information that might seem important to execute the strategy. A big thing about executing these strategies as well and using these guides is to sometimes only take the info you need, because there are some guides out there like mine which present you with many options. So to properly execute that strategy in the guide, look at your lineup, look at your units, find what's correctly fit for you. Yes, if you have Ubers, replace Neandum. This is where your critical thinking will come into play, because at this point, you're not just reading or searching or just looking at the guide. At this point, you're trying to replicate it. You're trying to execute it. Copying a lineup and hopping into the stage is always a no-go. You have to apply the knowledge you got from the guide and put it into your run. And the series I mentioned earlier does perfectly showcase how to execute these guides, and that is the using my own guides to beat X stage series, of course. So while executing these guides might seem like a tall task, it's usually made to be way bigger than it seems. It's as simple as just taking some mental notes while watching the guide and trying to implement them into your own gameplay. But let's finally wrap this up, because I don't want to make this video too lengthy or too intimidating. The biggest takeaway from this video is actually watch the guides and listen to them if you're surfing through them. Self-research is often needed, so don't be confused if you're expected to know some things at a certain point in the game. And hey, sometimes skill issue is real. Maybe you have higher level units and way better units used in the guide, but you still can't seem to beat the stage trying to execute a guide. So don't expect to beat everything in one try, even if some guides does make it seem easy. So yes, skill issue is real. Don't be afraid of it, embrace it, and improve at tapping those boxes. Old guides are not obsolete. Ponos rarely or even sometimes never changes stages unless it is like game breaking or unbalanced. So older guides are never obsolete. It's your job to adapt and use newer units or better substitutes, because the guide has already done its job by guiding you into the right direction. Sometimes you might not meet the requirements, and if you don't, just be patient. Don't always try to force yourself to beat the stage. There's always the next time. This is where people usually end up spending hundreds of cat food on retries or cat god or power-ups. You don't have to beat the stage in this very moment. Get the necessary requirements, get those treasures, come back on a later day and try to execute it again. And lastly, yes, Warrior does indeed help in that stage. But yeah, this has been a guide on how to use a guide. I would have liked to go into way more detail here and explain all of the technical things about a guide, like the timings and the enemy cycles and the unit rolls and such. But I think I'll make separate videos for those, otherwise this video would become over 30-40 minutes long. But this should give you a general idea of how to use a guide now. But yeah, now that this video is going to be out, prepare for a barrage of guides to be posted. Discord link down below, everything like that. that's it. It's been John Boogle, and see ya.